In June 1941, Hitler initiated Operation Barbarossa, marking the largest invasion in history. This act sent shockwaves through Europe and established a more brutal occupation regime. The Eastern Front intensified terror in several ways. Millions of Soviet prisoners of war were abandoned to die. Auxiliary forces and those loyal to Andrei Vlasov were integrated into German units. The SS actively recruited from the Baltic region to the Caucasus. Within the Nazi framework, Hermann Göring extracted resources, Heinrich Himmler cleared land for colonization, and Alfred Rosenberg's ministry was sidelined. Baca's hunger plan and Friedrich Koch's harsh rule in Ukraine led to agricultural collapse. Transport systems were strained, making starvation both a policy and a reality. Next, we look at occupied Europe. Slave labor roundups organized by Fritz Sauckel and Albert Speer filled factories in the Reich. Western economies suffered from cash shortages and a burgeoning black market. There was a complex mix of collaboration and rebellion. In Poland, the Home Army operated alongside secret drops from Britain's Special Operations Executive. Yugoslavia saw conflict between partisans and Chetniks. In Greece, the National Liberation Front and National Republican Greek League were active. The Vichy regime enforced strict policing, while John Moulin coordinated resistance efforts in France. Belgium and the Netherlands experienced heightened oppression, including the England spiel deception. Denmark managed to save its Jewish population, while Norway executed the Telemark sabotage. In Czechoslovakia, the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich led to the brutal massacre of Lidis. This segment illustrates how Operation Barbarossa transformed occupational authority, revealing who governed, who resisted, and the reasons the system perpetually consumed itself. The invasion of the Soviet Union significantly influenced German policies of occupation across much of Europe. In the East, the alluring yet terrifying prospect of dominating millions intensified the Nazis' use of terror. Early expectations from senior officers that they could win over nationalities like the Balts and Ukrainians for the anti-Bolshevik campaign faded. Ultimately, Hitler sought to instill fear for its own sake. He believed countries like Poland should be completely obliterated. Despite his disdain for the idea of Slavs in Wehrmacht uniforms, nearly 1 million Soviet citizens nonetheless served with the German army and the SS. Many were coerced from prison camps to become unarmed highway auxiliaries in German divisions. Some of these individuals were informally accepted as full-fledged soldiers. A commander of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, proudly spoke of his Russian driver and bodyguard who was always by his side. More than 100,000 individuals served in General Vlasov's Russian Army of Liberation, with varying levels of enthusiasm and effectiveness. This included a Cossack corps that fought partisans on Soviet land, as well as later in Yugoslavia and Italy. The Ukrainian police and concentration camp guards earned a dreadful reputation for their cruelty. Heinrich Himmler also began conscripting Latvians, Estonians, ethnic Caucasians, and even Bosnian Muslims into Waffen-SS units. In 1943, he created a Ukrainian division labeled the SS Galicia Division, aiming to avoid angering Adolf Hitler. Around 100,000 Ukrainians volunteered, but only about a third were accepted. The treatment of civilians in the occupied areas and prisoners of war was horrific. By February 1942, 60% of the 3.5 million Red Army prisoners had died from starvation, exposure, or illness. Committed Nazis took pride in their lack of compassion. Their dehumanization of groups such as Jews, Slavs, Asiatics, and Roma was a calculated strategy. They aimed to reduce these people through humiliation and suffering to the level of animals to demonstrate their supposed genetic inferiority. The intense competition among Hitler's subordinates in the East was even more chaotic than that within Germany, between the Nazi Party and various government branches. Alfred Rosenberg was appointed as minister for the Eastern Territories, but encountered opposition at every turn. His office was mocked, partly because he was one of the few civilian leaders who sought to involve former Soviet nations in the battle against Bolshevism. Hermann Göring, controlling the war economy, aimed to loot the occupied regions and starve their populations. Himmler wanted to cleanse these areas through mass murder in preparation for German settlement. As a result, Rosenberg had no real authority over security, food supply, or the economy, leaving him powerless. He even lacked control over Erich Koch, the Reichskommissar for Ukraine and Gauleiter of East Prussia. Koch, a violent drunkard, referred to the local people with derogatory terms. Herbert Backe's hunger plan intended to eliminate up to 30 million Soviet citizens, but never moved beyond the planning stage. While starvation was widespread, it was not as organized as the Nazis had envisioned. Military leaders ignored orders to isolate cities and starve the inhabitants. The Wehrmacht required a significant number of Soviet workers to meet their demands. Backe's approach of relying on local resources to supply both the Reich and the Wehrmacht was a disastrous failure. Agriculture in the Ukrainian breadbasket had nearly collapsed due to Soviet scorched earth tactics, war damage, population loss, the evacuation of machinery, and partisan actions. For the Wehrmacht, living off the land meant seizing fodder and grain, as well as indiscriminately slaughtering poultry and livestock, without considering future supplies or the survival of the civilians producing them. The shortage of rolling stock and motor transport made it impossible to distribute any available food effectively. The Nazi aspirations for the future were nothing more than a grotesque fantasy. The General Plan East envisioned a Germanic empire stretching to the Ural Mountains, complete with autobahns connecting newly established cities, satellite towns, and model farms operated by armed settlers, while deemed inferior people worked the fields. Himmler fantasized about cozy German colonies filled with gardens and orchards on the former sites of mass killings orchestrated by his SS Einsatzgruppen. Additionally, the Crimea would be transformed into a holiday destination, renamed Gotengau, becoming the German Riviera. However, the central challenge was finding enough people who could be deemed suitable to repopulate the eastern territories. Very few Danes, Dutch, or Norwegians volunteered for this cause. There was even a bizarre proposal to send Slavs to Brazil and replace them with German settlers from the Santa Catarina province. By the time of the defeat at Stalingrad and the withdrawal from the Caucasus, it became evident that there were not nearly enough Germans, whether genuine, reprocessed, or drafted, to reach the target of 120 million and fulfill Hitler's and Himmler's vision. The ethnic cleansing and forced population transfers throughout Central Europe were not only cruel, but also wasteful in terms of manpower and resources during a critical period of the war. Colonists were unable to farm the land as effectively as those they replaced, leading to a significant decline in agricultural production. The German war effort reached a critical point. It struggled with a severe shortage of manpower. In response, Fritz Sauckel, alongside Armaments Minister Albert Speer, traveled through occupied territories. They aimed to recruit 5 million workers for factories, mines, ironworks, and farms. This led to the establishment of numerous camps for forced labor throughout the Reich. German civilians looked at these foreign workers with apprehension, viewing them as potential threats. High-ranking Nazi officials recognized the irony. They had reduced their own racially undesirable population, but were now bringing vast numbers of outsiders into Germany. Senior Nazis had promised a greater German economic sphere and a European economic union that would improve living standards. However, their conflicting policies and the need to exploit conquered nations had the opposite effect. Occupied countries faced financial burdens imposed by German forces. Some businesses thrived through their collaboration with the occupiers. Yet in nearly every country, except for a semi-autonomous Denmark, the general populace became substantially poorer. Most Western European countries were compelled to surrender a quarter to a third of their earnings, while Germany seized significant portions of their agricultural output to feed its own citizens. This situation gave rise to a thriving black market and soaring inflation in occupied regions. From the beginning, Winston Churchill hoped to convert European dissatisfaction with Nazi rule into open rebellion. In May 1940, he appointed Dr. Hugh Dalton, a wealthy socialist, as Minister for Economic Warfare. Dalton was tasked with overseeing the formation of the Special Operations Executive. Though he was not well liked within the Labour Party, Dalton had played a crucial role in shifting its stance away from pacifism. He admired Churchill, but that sentiment was not mutual. Churchill found Dalton's loud voice and dubious gaze hard to tolerate, and remarked on Sir Robert Vansittart the permanent undersecretary at the Foreign Office in the 1930s, saying, "Extraordinary fellow, Van, he actually likes Dr. Dalton." Dalton, a passionate supporter of Poland, recruited Colonel Colin Gubbins. Gubbins had served as a liaison officer with the Polish army during its 1939 confrontations. He would later assume command of the Special Operations Executive. The Polish resistance served as a significant inspiration for the Special Operations Executive. Even after Poland surrendered at the end of September 1939, Polish soldiers continued to fight in the Kielce district under Major Henryk Dobrzyski until May 1940. Others resisted in the area of Sandomierz along the upper Vistula River. A dedicated Polish section was established within the Special Operations Executive, but its function was limited to collaborating with the Polish Army's 6th Bureau in London and offering support. No military missions were dispatched to occupied Poland, resulting in the Poles managing their own operations. Following the substantial contribution of Polish pilots during the Battle of Britain, the Special Operations Executive convinced the Royal Air Force to modify a Whitley bomber with extra fuel tanks. This modification allowed the aircraft to undertake the long round trip from a base in Scotland. The first delivery of Polish couriers occurred on February 15, 1941. Parachute containers were also created to drop weapons and explosives for the Armia Krajowa, or Home Army. Polish patriotism, while romantic in some aspects, remained remarkably steadfast during the harshest times of both Nazi and Soviet rule. Following the mass executions and individual killings that came after the German invasion, more than 30,000 Poles were sent to concentration camps, with many confined to the newly established Auschwitz. Although Poland's army was defeated in September 1939, a new underground resistance movement emerged shortly thereafter. At its peak, the Home Army grew to nearly 400,000 members. The incredibly resourceful Polish intelligence services, known for providing the first Enigma machine, continued to assist the Allies throughout the war. The Poles even managed to secretly recover a trial V-2 rocket that had crashed in their marshes and disassembled it. A specially modified transport C-47 Dakota was flown to Poland to bring back the components for examination by Allied scientists. Both the Home Army and the intelligence networks communicated with the Polish government in exile based in London, which Stalin reluctantly recognized in August 1941 after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. The Home Army consistently faced a shortage of weapons. Initially, it focused on freeing prisoners and sabotaging railway communications, which significantly helped the Red Army, though this assistance went largely unrecognized. Armed attacks followed later. Poles who were released from Soviet labor camps to join the forces led by General W. Adis, Anders never wavered in their hatred for their oppressors. The London government in exile grew increasingly suspicious of Joseph Stalin when it learned he was asking the British to accept the border he had settled with Adolf Hitler after the Nazi-Soviet pact. In April 1943, a crisis erupted when the Germans announced they had found mass graves of Polish officers in the Katy Forest. These officers had been executed by the Soviet security organization known as the NKVD. The Soviet regime had always claimed ignorance about the fate of these prisoners, and at the time, even the Polish people did not believe Stalin's government could execute such a massacre. The Kremlin argued that this discovery was a German propaganda scheme, insisting that Nazis were responsible for the killings. The Polish government in exile called for an investigation by the International Red Cross, while the British felt deeply embarrassed. Winston Churchill had suspicions that the Soviets could commit such atrocities, but he found himself unable to confront Stalin. This was especially difficult at a time when he had to again acknowledge that an invasion of France was off the table for that year. In June, further calamities struck the Polish people. The Germans in Warsaw captured the commander and other leaders of the Home Army. Yet, worse tragedies were still to unfold for Poland. In the summer of 1941, there were early attacks by Red Army soldiers on German troops in the Soviet Union, cut off by the swift advance of the Wehrmacht. However, the first major uprising against Nazi occupation occurred in Serbia after the start of Operation Barbarossa. This took the German occupying forces by surprise. Soon after their victory that spring, a lieutenant had proudly written home saying, "We soldiers are like gods here." The quick surrender of the country that April had led them to expect little resistance, but they had underestimated how many Yugoslav soldiers had retained and hidden their weapons. Serbia fell under the command of General Feldmarschall Wilhelm List, based in Greece. The three divisions of General Lieutenant Paul Batter's LVI's Corps were poorly trained and under-equipped. Ordered to take retaliatory actions, they primarily executed Jews who had already been rounded up. But the executions of villagers near ambush sites only empowered the communist partisans, drawing in many who sought revenge for their family members' deaths. General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel at Führer headquarters demanded ruthless reprisals. The ratio was increased to 100 Serbs for every German soldier killed, based on the belief that the local mentality only understood violence. In September, a significant punitive offensive occurred with support from the 342nd Infantry Division. Local German commanders chose to begin by executing interned Jews. By mid-October 1941, around 2,100 Jews and Roma were shot in retaliation for the deaths of 21 German soldiers at the hands of communist partisans. This marked the first mass murder of Jews outside Soviet or Polish territories. The partisan attacks were led by Josip Broz, known as Tito, who had been a successful Comintern organizer during the Spanish Civil War. Tito, a charismatic leader with striking looks, had revitalized the Yugoslav Communist Party. He believed that communists everywhere should aid their counterparts in the Soviet Union. The international outlook of the party managed to navigate the worst ethnic and religious divides in Yugoslavia, which included Catholic Croats, Orthodox Serbs, and Muslim Bosnians. In contrast, the rival resistance movement led by General Draža Mihailović was primarily Serb. Mihailović, who wore glasses and had a gloomy demeanor, resembled an Orthodox priest more than a military leader. He was unable to compete with Tito's charisma. Mihailović aimed to strengthen his forces for the day when the Allies would arrive, so he could join them and restore the monarchy under young King Peter. He correctly predicted that Tito intended to leverage the partisan war to seize total control when the Red Army arrived. Though he wished to avoid provoking retaliation, his forces did engage the Germans at times, despite communist propaganda suggesting otherwise. Other groups, also calling themselves partisans, collaborated closely with the Germans and the puppet regime of General Milan Nedić. This confusion later helped the communists tarnish Mihailović's reputation among the British. An even more deadly aspect of the civil war in Yugoslavia came from the fiercely anti-Serb and anti-Semitic Ustaš, a group affiliated with the Croat state of Ante Pavelić, which was a loyal ally of the Germans. The Ustaša instigated a reign of terror in the region. Over 500,000 Yugoslavs lost their lives in the factional fighting between rival forces during the war. Following further skirmishes, additional German massacres occurred, including the execution of several thousand Serb civilians to fulfill reprisal quotas. Some German officers began to realize the foolishness of their policy. This policy focused solely on the people who had not fled. These individuals had nothing to do with the assaults on German soldiers. After approximately 15,000 people had died, and with very few Jews and Gypsies remaining to execute, the quotas for reprisals started to decrease, all without Berlin's awareness. The significant reduction in the number of hostages began in March 1942 when a large gas van arrived in Belgrade. About 7,500 Jews held in the camp at Semlin were asphyxiated as they were transported through the Serbian capital to a mass grave near a shooting range on the city's outskirts. The German ambassador felt deep embarrassment over the blatant nature of these actions. However, on May 29, 1942, the head of the security police boasted to Berlin that Belgrade was the only major city in Europe without Jews. Warfare in Yugoslavia grew increasingly brutal as the Germans launched repeated offensives into the Bosnian mountains. Partisan soldiers captured by German forces were crushed under tanks. Tito organized his forces into brigades of 1,000, but wisely avoided conventional military strategies. Discipline within the ranks was strict. with no fraternization allowed between the men and the many young women fighting alongside them. By the fall of 1942, Tito's partisans had nearly complete control over their mountainous region, stretching across western Bosnia and eastern Croatia. He established his headquarters in the town of Biha after driving out the Ustaše. The British recognized the royalist Yugoslav government in exile based in London and offered support to Mihailović, its appointed representative. Moscow also did not object, as it officially recognized the Yugoslav government. Throughout 1942, ultra-intercepts and other reports showed that Tito's forces were attacking the Germans while the other factions waited. Efforts by Special Operations Executive Liaison Officers, who parachuted in to encourage the rival resistance movements to collaborate, yielded little success. As Allied interest in the Mediterranean grew following the German defeat in North Africa, the British reached out to Tito. Fearing a landing in the Balkans and determined to protect the coast and secure mineral supplies, the Germans launched new offensives with their own troops along with Italian forces. Tito made a fighting retreat into Montenegro, narrowly avoiding being encircled at the Neretva River. With his forces largely intact and soon receiving British support, Tito's partisans experienced rapid growth. Mihailović, abandoned by the Allies after failing to meet specific requests, was destined to lose the ongoing civil war. To the south, Albania remained under Italian occupation. Abbas Kupi, a supporter of King Zog who had fled when Mussolini invaded in 1939, began small-scale resistance efforts in the spring of 1941. After the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, Albanian communists led by Enver Hoxha launched a much more aggressive campaign in the south. Similar to Yugoslavia, the British chose to support the communists because they were more committed to the fight. Little assistance was given to Abbas Kupi, which frustrated the British Special Operations Executive Liaison Officers, and ultimately Hoxha's communists eliminated their competition. Greece was of much greater importance to the British. Winston Churchill firmly supported King George II and was unwilling to allow the country to fall into the hands of the communist EAM-ELAS guerrilla movement. Unfortunately for the British, many monarchists collaborated with German and Italian forces due to a mix of anti-communism and self-interest. The authoritarian regime of General Metaxas fueled anti-monarchist sentiments, allowing the small Greek Communist Party to quickly increase its influence. The Axis powers looted the country, and an ineffective Italian occupation caused widespread suffering, leading to a terrible famine in the winter of 1941. The ruthless communist leader, Aris Valouchiotis, began forming a partisan force in the Pindus Mountains in 1942. His main opponent was General Napoleon Zervas, a cheerful, bearded figure who established EDIS, a left-of-center non-communist group. Zervas's forces were smaller and based in Epirus in the northwest. As communist strength expanded, they became cut off from the rest of Greece, while other smaller resistance groups like ECA were eventually absorbed by the communist-dominated EM-ELAS. 2 British Special Operations Executive Officers were parachuted into Greece during the summer of 1942. They faced many challenges before making contact with both Zervas and ELAS. Their primary objective was to organize an attack on the main railway line that transported supplies from Germany for Rommel's Panzer Army in North Africa. They successfully convinced Zervas and the National Liberation Front to collaborate on an operation to destroy the Gorgopotamos railway bridge. While the partisans attacked the Italian positions at both ends, a demolition team flew in from Cairo. They affixed large amounts of plastic explosives to the bridge's supporting piers. This became one of the war's most effective sabotage missions, cutting off the railway line for 4 months. In March 1943, German forces and the SS began gathering 60,000 Greek Jews, mostly from the city of Salonika, which had a significant Jewish community for centuries. Although they provided shelter for some escapees, the Greek resistance could not halt the railway transports leading to concentration camps in Poland, where many faced horrific medical experiments. After the rare cooperation between the National Liberation Front and the Greek Democratic National Army during the Gorgopotamos operation, Special Operations Executive Liaison Officers encountered political rivalries as Greece became caught in a civil war among guerrilla factions. Zervos was easier to work with. However, the British had to also supply arms to the National Liberation Front for Operation Animals. This campaign involved attacks in the summer of 1943 before the invasion of Sicily. Alongside the deception plan known as Operation Mincemeat, the goal was to convince the Germans that the Allies intended to land in Greece. Operation Mincemeat involved dropping a corpse, disguised as a Royal Marines officer, carrying important documents off the southern coast of Spain. This misinformation campaign aligned with Hitler's beliefs about his enemy's intentions, reinforcing his conviction that the British planned to invade southern Europe through the Balkans. His Austrian roots fueled his obsession with the region. As a result, a panzer division and additional forces were diverted to Greece right before the landings in Sicily. The leaders of the National Liberation Front were split on how to engage with the British. They sought the support and legitimacy an alliance with the Allies would provide, yet they were deeply suspicious of British intentions. In August 1943, partisan delegates were flown to Cairo for a meeting. The Communists, like many Greeks at the time, opposed restoring the monarchy. They contended that King George should only return if a plebiscite allowed for it. The Greek government in exile and the British, urged on by Churchill, would not accept the situation. They unfairly blamed the Special Operations Executive for the political deadlock that had developed. The representatives of the National Liberation Army returned determined to defeat their rivals, set up a provisional government, and prevent any British attempt to restore the monarchy. Meanwhile, the resistance on Crete faced few political challenges. Most of the guerrilla leaders, known as capitans, followed British advice. They were not monarchists, but they were strongly opposed to communism. Only small groups in the island's east side with the National Liberation Front. In France, a large portion of the population, including Republicans, welcomed Marshal Pétain's armistice with a sense of relief. They did not know that at that time, German plans aimed to reduce France to the status of a tourist destination and to annex Alsace and Lorraine for the Reich. This would force French men into the German military. The French tried to carry on with their daily lives as best they could in these new circumstances. This proved especially difficult for the wives of the 1.5 million prisoners of war still held in Germany. The occupation caused suffering, as Germans seized a large share of French agricultural output, leading to significant hardship in towns and cities, particularly for those without connections to the countryside. The average height of boys fell by 7 centimeters, while girls saw a drop of 11 centimeters during the war. Toward the end of 1940, small resistance groups began publishing underground newspapers, often inspired by Charles de Gaulle's broadcasts from London, which proclaimed that the fight would continue. These groups included individuals from various backgrounds and political affiliations. At this point, there were few overt acts of resistance against the Germans. It was only after the invasion of the Soviet Union that armed attacks began, led by supporters of the French Communist Party. After losing credibility and members during the Nazi-Soviet pact, the party started to form a more effective underground network. The German military occupation since 1940 had been relatively orderly. However, as the war shifted towards total conflict and with the assassination of German officers and soldiers by communists, the SS began to assert control. In May 1942, Reinhard Heydrich traveled to Paris to appoint Gruppenführer Karl Albrecht Oberg as the chief of SS and police. Hitler treated France better than many other conquered nations. This was mainly because if France managed its own affairs for German interests, it reduced the number of soldiers the Wehrmacht needed for occupation. However, Pétain's dream of rallying his fractured country under the État français could not last long. The defeat deepened the existing divisions within French society. Even the pre-war right fractured into various factions. A small minority felt ashamed by the defeat and wished to resist German control. In contrast, the fascist Germanophiles held disdain for Pétain. They thought his cautious collaboration was not enough. Jacques Doriot's Parti populaire français, Marcel Déat's Rassemblement national populaire, and Eugène Deloncle's Mouvement Social Révolutionnaire endorsed the Nazi vision of a new order in Europe. They believed that France could regain its status as a great power alongside the Third Reich. However, their delusions were greater than those of the old Marshal. The Germans never took them seriously. At best, they were the Nazi equivalent of Lenin's useful idiots. Conflict among the extreme right was mirrored by rivalries within the German ranks. Otto Abetz, the friendly ambassador to France, was often mocked by prominent Nazis, especially Hermann Göring. The SS and the military frequently clashed, and Paris became home to many German offices and command centers, each pursuing its own agenda. The heart of occupied Paris was cluttered with signs pointing in every direction. SS Gruppenführer Oberg was content with the support he received from Vichy's police. At that point in the war, the Third Reich was short on troops for the Eastern Front, and Oberg had fewer than 3,000 German police to cover all of occupied France. René Bousquet, the Secretary General of Police under Pierre Laval, was a young, energetic administrator rather than a right-wing ideologue. Like other young technocrats working to revamp Vichy's governance, Bousquet believed that the État français had to maintain control over security matters to remain relevant. If that meant exceeding his authority to round up foreign Jews for deportation, he was willing to disregard Pétain's orders against involving the French police. On July 16, 1942, 9,000 police officers from Paris, following the orders of Bousquet, conducted early morning raids to capture stateless Jews in the city. They rounded up around 28,000 individuals, which included 3,000 children who had not been requested by the Germans. These individuals were detained at the Velodrome d'Hiver Stadium and at a transit camp in Drancy, located on the outskirts of Paris, before being transported to death camps in the east. Additional roundups occurred in the unoccupied southern zone. Oberg was pleased with Bousquet's actions, although Eichmann remained dissatisfied. The arrival of the American army in the Mediterranean, along with clear signs of the Axis powers' impending defeat, spurred significant resistance growth. The German control over the unoccupied zone and the assassination of Darlan in late 1942 also had a profound impact. At the end of January 1943, the Vichy regime sought to strengthen its power by creating the Milice Française, a paramilitary group led by Joseph Darnand. This organization drew in a mix of extreme right-wing ideologues, anti-Semites, reactionaries from the struggling provincial nobility, naive rural youths fascinated by the allure of firearms, and criminals enticed by the chance to plunder the homes of those they captured. The establishment of the milice reignited the long-standing civil conflict between the two Frances that had begun since 1789 revolution. On one side were the Catholic right-wing factions who despised Freemasons, the left, and the Republic, which they derogatorily referred to as la goose, meaning the slut. On the opposite side stood Republicans and anti-clericals who had backed the Popular Front in 1936. However, the French population under occupation was diverse and did not fit neatly into categories. Some well-meaning leftists even condemned Jews, while black marketeers helped some escape, sometimes without demanding payment. The German occupation of southern and eastern France through Operation Anton also led many who had been only lukewarm supporters of Pétain to switch allegiance. Among the 100,000 personnel in the Army of the Armistice, the only high-ranking officer to resist the German forces was General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, a charismatic leader flown out by the Allies and subsequently made commander of the French First Army. Many other officers chose to go underground and joined a new movement known as the Organisation de Résistance de l'Armée, or ORA. Initially hesitant to support de Gaulle, they recognized only General Giraud. The French Communist Party predictably viewed the late defectors with deep suspicion. They labeled it Vichy back to front. Meanwhile, other military officers and officials fled to North Africa, where Admiral Darlan's regime was known as Vichy American style. When François Mitterrand, a former Vichy official who later became a socialist president of the Republic, landed in Algiers, General de Gaulle looked at him with distrust. This was not due to Mitterrand's past with Vichy, but rather because he had arrived on a British airplane. De Gaulle resented British involvement in French affairs. He particularly disliked the support that the Special Operations Executive, or SOE, offered to French resistance groups. He wanted all resistance efforts to fall under his command, specifically the Bureau Central de Renseignements et d'Action, or BCRA. De Gaulle was frustrated that the SOE's F section, directed by Colonel Maurice Buckmaster, had almost 100 independent circuits operating in France. Initially, the Foreign Office had instructed F section to avoid the Free French in London. F section wanted to comply, partly for security reasons. The Free French were known for being careless, and their basic code system was easily deciphered by the Germans. Additionally, F section recognized how intense political rivalries in France could become. As one senior SOE officer noted, the benefit of SOE staying neutral while controlling arms supply was that it helped reduce the risk of civil war when liberation occurred. SOE also established Section RF. This section worked closely with the BCRA, supplying weapons and aircraft, and it had its offices near the BCRA's headquarters on Duke Street, north of Oxford Street. The BCRA was led by André de Wavrin, more commonly known by his nom de guerre, Colonel Passy. His organization was initially divided between intelligence and its Action Service, which focused on armed resistance. Passy was rumored to have connections to the fiercely anti-communist Cagoule, though this was never confirmed. However, he did have a few members of the Cagoule working for him. The coal cellar in the Duke Street headquarters became a makeshift holding area. French volunteers suspected of being Vichy spies or communists were detained and questioned by Capitaine Roger Wybot. Reports of torture and suspicious deaths emerged, causing anger and embarrassment within the SOE. On the 14th of January, 1943, the chief of the security service, Guy Liddell, noted in his diary that he believed it was time to close Duke Street. Charles de Gaulle's resolve to unite the resistance under his leadership grew stronger. Despite being a career military officer, he had little faith in irregular forces. If the resistance in France recognized his authority, the British and especially the Americans would have to pay attention. Few groups were aligned with Gaullism, apart from the Confrérie de Notre Dame, managed by Colonel Raymie, the pseudonym of filmmaker Gilbert Renault. However, organizations like Combat, established by Henri Frenet, began to see the importance of collaboration. The Communists, in contrast, were wary of de Gaulle. They feared he would emerge as a right-wing military dictator. In the fall of 1941, Jean Moulin, who had been the youngest prefect in France in 1940, arrived in London. Moulin was a natural leader. Both the Special Operations Executive and de Gaulle recognized him as the person to unify the resistance. On New Year's Day 1942, Moulin returned to France with de Gaulle's order appointing him delegate general. His mission was to reorganize the networks into small cells to minimize the risk of infiltration by agents from the Abwehr and the Sicherheitsdienst, which was often mistaken for the Gestapo. The resistance was advised not to engage in open warfare, but to prepare for the liberation of France by Allied forces. Moulin needed a military commander for what would later be known as the Secret Army. He enlisted General Charles Delestrange. Moulin worked diligently to win over the main networks in the unoccupied zone, including Combat, Liberation, and France Tireur, which was not to be confused with the communist group France Tireur et Partisans. Despite these achievements, the British government remained unwilling to transfer F section to the Free French. Ironically, American backing for Admiral John Darlan helped de Gaulle reach a compromise with the Communists. The Communists were furious that the Allies supported Darlan, who had been Vichy's prime minister while their members were executed as hostages. In January 1943, Fernand Grenier arrived in London as the French Communist Party's representative to the Free French. The next month, Pierre Laval, responding to German demands for more workers to be sent to the Reich, established the Service de Travail Obligatoire. This forced conscription of labor was deeply resented in France. It led tens of thousands of young men to flee to the mountains and forests. Resistance groups faced an overwhelming influx of individuals. Although they struggled to provide food and weapons, the Maquis emerged as a mass movement. In the spring, Moulin formed the Conseil National de la Résistance and reached out to networks in northern France to encourage their support. However, in June, a series of disasters occurred, primarily due to poor security. The SD infiltrated group after group. General Delestraint was arrested in the Paris metro. On June 21st, Jean Moulin and all members of the Conseil National de la Résistance were captured in a house on the outskirts of Lowlands. Moulin was brutally tortured by SS Hauptsturmführer Klaus Barbie and died 2 weeks later without revealing any information. The British, shocked by the security lapses and ongoing arrests, became increasingly hesitant to trust the BCRA. The Gaullists reformed the Resistance Council, this time led by Georges Bidault, a sincere but uncharismatic left-leaning Catholic. Due to Bidault's lack of Moulin's decisiveness, the Communists, who faced few infiltrations in their tightly knit cell system, gained significant influence. The Communists agreed to collaborate with the Gaullist secret army, hoping to receive substantial supplies of weapons and funds from the Special Operations Executive. They also aimed to place their own submarines in various resistance committees. These submarines were secret communists pretending not to be associated with the party. Their vision for the liberation of France starkly contrasted with the Gaullist perspective. Through control of committees and the increasing power of their armed forces in the France Terreur et Partisan, they aimed to turn liberation into a revolution. Unbeknownst to them, Stalin had different priorities, and they underestimated the political acumen of the Gaullists. Charles de Gaulle, who had nearly faded into obscurity due to the Darlan Agreement and the Americans' support for General Giraud, soon regained his influence over his rival. Roosevelt sent Jean Monnet to advise Giraud. Monnet had previously been against de Gaulle, but he now showed his sense of realism. He worked behind the scenes to ensure a smooth transition of power. On the 30th of May, 1943, de Gaulle arrived at Maison Blanche airfield in Algiers. Giraud welcomed him while a band played the Marseillaise. The British and Americans observed from a distance. A wave of disagreements and rumors of plots, including thoughts of kidnappings, quickly erupted. This intrigue led General Pierre de Bénouville to comment that nothing resembled Vichy more than Algiers. On the 3rd of June, the Comité Français de Libération Nationale was formed with de Gaulle effectively controlling nearly every aspect of what was clearly a government poised to take power. De Gaulle, demonstrating remarkable foresight, recognized the necessity of forging ties with Stalin. He sought to manage the French communists better and decided to send a representative to Moscow. The Free French, unlike the other Western allies, had already contributed a fighter group to the Eastern Front. On the 1st of September, 1942, the Groupe de Chasse Normandie assembled in Baku, Azerbaijan, for operational and training purposes on the Yak-7 fighter. After entering combat on the 22nd of March, 1943, the Normandy-Niemen Group, as it was known, would later claim the destruction of 273 Luftwaffe aircraft. De Gaulle believed that strong relations between the Soviet Union and France would provide Stalin with leverage in the West and enhance his own position in dealings with the Anglo-Saxons. Following the conquest of Belgium, Hitler planned to grant preferential treatment to the Flemings. He envisioned them as potential sub-German annexes to the Reich in a future European reorganization. Portions of Belgian territory south of Aachen and the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg were incorporated into the Reich. The requirement for additional manpower on the Eastern Front led Himmler in 1942 to bolster the Waffen-SS with units from Germanic nations, including Scandinavians, the Dutch, and the Flemish. Beyond the Légion Wallonie, which fascist Léon de Grelle raised and saw as a path to leadership in Belgium's new order, a Flemish legion was also formed. In total, around 40,000 Belgians from both communities served in the Waffen-SS, which was double the number of Frenchmen who joined the SS Charlemagne division. Most Belgians strongly disliked this second German occupation of their country within a quarter of a century. Underground newspapers thrived, and young resistors turned to graffiti to protest against the occupation. Similar to other occupied nations, they chalked V signs for Allied victory on walls. When Rudolf Hess flew to Britain in 1941, they also painted Heil Hess on surfaces. The German army, adopting a practical stance, mostly overlooked these minor annoyances. However, when strikes began to disrupt industrial production, their response intensified. Armed resistance was too dangerous, so some well-placed Belgians, including former intelligence officers, worked to gather intelligence for the Allies. Eventually, an underground group known as the Armée Secrète was created, with around 50,000 members, but it needed to wait until liberation was near. There was significant distrust between the Belgian government in exile based in London and the Special Operations Executive Section overseeing their efforts. The most effective leader, who took charge in mid-1943, was Hardy Amies, who would later become the Queen's dress designer. A more aggressive organization was the communist-led Front de l'Indépendance. This group not only instigated strikes but also assassinated collaborators on the streets. Other courageous groups set up escape routes for Allied aircrew shot down during the strategic bombing of Germany. The Comet Line, established by a young woman named André de Jong, who used the codename Day, was the most successful. Many Belgians took enormous risks to hide fellow Belgian-born Jews. However, Jewish refugees from other nations trapped in Belgium were less fortunate. They constituted a large part of the 30,000 sent to camps. The Netherlands, having remained neutral during the First World War, felt the shock of occupation even more acutely than Belgium. Although a small number collaborated or later joined the Waffen-SS Netherlands Division, the majority of the Dutch population grew increasingly anti-German. Similar to Belgium, the roundup of Jews in February 1941 triggered a strike that resulted in harsh reprisals. One Dutch resistance group set fire to the birth registry in Amsterdam to disrupt German searches, but most of the 140,000 Jews in the Netherlands were transported to death camps, including the young Anne Frank. With the war in the East starting, German occupation authorities imposed a much harsher regime. On May 4, 1942, the Germans executed 72 members of the Dutch resistance and imprisoned hundreds of others. The Sicherheitsdienst had already been active in the Netherlands before the war. So when opposition to forced labor recruitment increased, their arrests were very deliberate. They quickly rounded up Dutch intelligence contacts after obtaining a list from 2 British Secret Intelligence Service officers captured at Venlo in 1940. The Abwehr also achieved significant success against the Dutch resistance starting in March 1942. They named this counterintelligence success Operation North Pole, or the England Spiel. This disaster was largely due to incredibly negligent practices at the Special Operations Executive's London headquarters. An SOE radio operator was captured during a sweep in The Hague. The Abwehr coerced him into transmitting to London. He did this, believing that his omission of the security check at the end of his message would alert London to his capture. To his shock, London thought he had simply forgotten the check and replied, instructing him to arrange a drop zone for another agent to parachute in. A German reception committee was ready for the new agent, who was also forced to signal back as instructed. This chain continued, with agent after agent being captured upon arrival. Each one was astonished to learn that the Germans knew everything about them, even the color of the walls in their briefing room back in England. The Abwehr and Sicherheitsdienst, for once cooperating smoothly, managed to capture around 50 Dutch officers and agents. This disaster severely damaged Anglo-Dutch relations. Many people in the Netherlands suspected betrayal from London. There was no conspiracy, just a tragic mix of incompetence, complacency, and ignorance about conditions in occupied Holland. Denmark, taken by surprise and overwhelmed by the Nazi invasion in 1940, chose a form of passive resistance during the early part of its occupation. The German regime adopted a light approach, essentially allowing the country to govern itself. This led Winston Churchill to unfairly label Denmark as Hitler's tame canary. Highly productive Danish farmers supplied up to 1/5 of the Reich's needs for butter, pork, and beef. Heinrich Himmler particularly wanted to recruit as many Danes as possible for the Waffen-SS, but most volunteers came from the German-speaking minority in the south. In November 1942, Adolf Hitler, frustrated by King Christian's open disdain, demanded a more compliant government. The unpopular pro-Nazi Erik Scavenius became the new prime minister. Scavenius aligned Denmark with the Anti-Comintern Pact and urged Danes to volunteer to fight in the Soviet Union. Although Denmark experienced one of the milder regimes under Nazi rule, the Danes successfully rescued nearly all the Jews in their nation. They smuggled them across the Kattegat to southern Sweden using fishing boats. The Danish underground, known as the Dansk Frihedsrådet, provided crucial intelligence to London, particularly for the Royal Air Force. It also conducted sabotage operations and, in 1943, established a shadow administration. Among the governments in exile in London, the Norwegian government was the most robust in terms of authority and resources. The large Norwegian merchant navy supported the British effort, significantly contributing to the battles in Atlantic and Arctic waters. Norway, which showed considerable support for King Haakon VII, faced less risk of civil war compared to other occupied nations during and after the war. Following Norway's defeat, Norwegian officers began organizing an underground army named Milorg by late 1940. By the war's conclusion, Milorg had grown to approximately 40,000 members. There was widespread frustration with the ineffective Allied intervention, and early in the German occupation, tensions arose between Norwegians and the Special Operations Executive, which aimed for a more aggressive campaign. Winston Churchill's desire to raid Norway, including 2 assaults on the Lofoten Islands in 1941, followed by calls for an invasion in 1942, caused significant stress for his military leaders. However, these raids reinforced Hitler's belief that the Allies would launch an attack across the North Sea. The German dictator insisted on keeping more than 400,000 troops stationed in Norway, much to the annoyance of his generals, effectively tying up substantial resources for almost 5 years. Given the size of the occupying force, it is understandable that Milorg hesitated to initiate a partisan war that could result in widespread civilian casualties. Norway's self-proclaimed leader, Vidkun Quisling, had previously headed a small party of Nazi supporters, known as the National Samling, before the war. After declaring himself the leader of a government during the German invasion, he was quickly ousted by Josef Terboven, the Reichskommissar, who held a deep disdain for him. In February 1942, Adolf Hitler named Quisling as minister-president, yet Terboven persistently sabotaged Quisling's grasp on power. The Riksdag was formed as a replica of the Nazi SA and attracted 50,000 members, mostly opportunists. Other Nazi groups, like the Hitler Youth, were also mimicked. With such a large occupying force, many Norwegian women became involved with German soldiers, resulting in over 10,000 children born from these relationships. Despite this, the majority of the population loathed their German occupiers. In April 1942, most Lutheran clergy publicly opposed the Quisling government. When the Germans ordered the deportation of Jews, only 767 out of 2,200 were taken. Many were smuggled to Sweden, which, while willing to sell Germany its valuable iron ore and other materials for the war effort, began to distance itself from its Nazi partner as the tide of war shifted against Germany. A key target for the Royal Air Force had been the Norse hydro plant in Telemark, which produced heavy water for what was believed to be the development of a German atomic bomb. However, airstrikes were deemed impractical, so the Special Operations Executive initiated a sabotage mission. A British commando operation in November 1942 ended tragically when 2 Horsa gliders crashed in poor weather. German troops captured the survivors of one glider, bound their hands with barbed wire, and executed them immediately. This was in accordance with Hitler's recent order that all members of special forces or raiding teams, regardless of their attire, be shot. The Germans soon learned from maps found in the wreckage what the mission's target had been. A group of 3 Norwegian commandos had parachuted into the mountains in October and endured a harsh winter, surviving in snow-covered huts and subsisting on wild reindeer meat. Their sole source of vitamin C came from the gur, the semi-digested green material found in the reindeer's stomachs. Finally, on February 17, 1943, another 6 Norwegian commandos, trained in Britain, parachuted in but landed on the wrong frozen lake in the mountains. In the end, the 2 groups came together and successfully placed explosives at the Vermork heavy water plant on the night of February 28th. They managed to enter and exit without firing a shot, causing significant damage. The Germans repaired the facilities and production resumed 4 months later. The United States 8th Air Force raids failed to effectively strike the target, so the Norwegian resistance was called upon once more. When enough heavy water was ready in February 1944, the Germans loaded it onto railway wagons and onto a ferry, unaware that 2 elderly members of the Norwegian resistance had secretly boarded the ferry the night before. They placed charges with timers made from alarm clocks. The ferry sank as planned in the deepest part of the lake. 14 civilians lost their lives, but the Norwegian authorities in London had previously agreed that the target justified the risk. Although German scientists were far from developing a nuclear bomb, the Allies could not afford to take any chances. The actions at Vemork were among the most successful sabotage operations of the war. Czechoslovakia, the first victim of German aggression, was abandoned by Britain and France in 1938 and then fully occupied by the Germans in March of the following year. However, Czech students celebrated their Independence Day on October 28, 1939, with a large demonstration. In response, the Nazis closed all universities and executed 9 students as a warning. Former Prime Minister Edvard Beneš established a government in exile in London, and Czech soldiers and pilots made their way to England. Czech pilots fought bravely and skillfully in the Royal Air Force. The Germans dismembered the country. The Sudetenland had already been annexed into the Reich. Slovakia became a puppet fascist state under Monsignor Josef Tiso, and the rest of the country was designated the Reich Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Initially, the Nazi regime avoided the harshest measures, but the Sicherheitsdienst was quick to eliminate any signs of dissent, especially after June 1941, when the Soviet Union joined the war on the side of the Allies. The Czech resistance, known as Úst idedvejný odboje domácího, began a campaign of sabotage targeting fuel dumps and railways, along with communist groups. Hitler appointed Reinhard Heydrich as the protector of Bohemia and Moravia to crush the opposition. Heydrich quickly adopted a policy of terror to ensure that war production would not be interrupted. He arrested the top officials and had them sentenced to death. In total, 92 people were executed within the first few days. Several thousand others were sent to Mauthausen concentration camp. Heydrich aimed to Germanize the region through widespread deportation. He also began transporting the area's 100,000 Jews to concentration camps, where nearly all of them perished. In London, the Czech government in exile made the decision to assassinate Heydrich. 2 young Czech volunteers underwent training by the Special Operations Executive and were parachuted into the country at the end of 1941. On May 27, 1942, after extensive reconnaissance, the 2-man team positioned themselves for a roadside ambush. One attempted to shoot Heydrich as his open Mercedes slowed for a sharp turn, but his submachine gun malfunctioned. His partner then threw an improvised bomb, wounding Heydrich in the explosion. Although his injuries were not immediately fatal, they became infected, and he succumbed to septicemia on June 4th. Although Hitler was furious that Heydrich had risked driving through Prague in an open vehicle, his anger towards the Czechs led to brutal reprisals, including killings and deportations. The villages of Lidice and Ležáky were annihilated, and all male residents over the age of 16 were executed. The women were sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. While not as extreme as some other Nazi atrocities, Lidice became a symbol of German oppression throughout the Western world.